Well, good afternoon here in the Central Time Zone. Thank you for joining us on the Green Room. My name is Jeff Russell. I'm the President and CEO of Delta Dental of Iowa, and we appreciate you joining us today. One of the best ways that I learn is through dialogue with other folks, and often that happens over a cup of coffee. So 3 years ago, we started the Green Room with this idea that we could have these important yet informal conversations with a variety of leaders and subject matter experts and invite you to join us at the coffee table. So a couple of housekeeping things. So today's event will be recorded. We'd love to have your questions. Feel free to put those in the chat. I'll try and get to those as we can throughout the conversation. So today's topic is caregiving, more than a full-time job for your employees, and the impact of employers and the caregiving experience. Excuse me. So I have three guests today I'm really excited about. The first is Candace Smith, who's the founder of Caregiving. The second is Marcia Aldridge, and who is the Vice President of Human Resources and Shared Services for IMT. And the third is Tiffany O'Donnell, CEO of Women Lead Change. So for the past 3 years, we've tried to curate these topics on leadership and workforce and benefits, and we hope to do that today. So let me just start off by saying a few things about caregiving. So in my mind, caregiving is an emerging issue. We'll hear more about these statistics, but 1 in 5 Americans, that means 1 in 5 of your employees, 1 in 5 of your friends, will deal with an issue in the coming years where they'll need to be taking care of an adult loved one, friend, peer, neighbor, someone in their life. We've all heard the concept of the sandwich generation, people caring for both their parents and for their children. And from a workforce perspective, I think this is a huge mental tax on employees, which turns into productivity issues for employers. So for Delta Dental, we've been looking at this issue for some time. And I think as many of you know, we were able to acquire Caregiving last fall. And some people have asked me, like, what was really your thinking behind bringing out some sort of caregiving app that is an employee benefit? And in my mind, I think this is about holistic well-being. So I think one of the things that's really come out of the pandemic is our conversation about not just talking about physical well-being, but emotional and financial well-being as well. And certainly this fits into that topic. You know, last time when we did this in February, we were talking about emotional health, and it was probably one of our best attended sessions ever. Because it's so top of mind for corporate leaders, HR leaders, and folks in today's world, as we've come out of the pandemic, I think we're all more attuned to the idea of emotional health. My prediction is that in 5 years, we're going to be having the same conversation about caregiving. That impact on productivity, that impact on the personal well-being of our employees is going to be similar. So what also struck me is I've been learning about this over the last year or so is the impact that this has on women leaders, and particularly on senior women leaders who might have the economic resources to be able to step away from their careers and their workforce or in their work life to be able to care for an adult loved one. So let's get started. I'm really excited about this. Again, feel free to send in your questions via the Q&A, and we will try and take those as we can. So our resources today, I want to introduce them, and then we'll ask them a first question. First is Marcia Aldridge. She's the Vice President of Human Resources and Shared Services for IMT Insurance here in West Des Moines. Marcia's career is focused on human resources with a passion for leadership development. And amongst her multiple leadership degrees, most recently, she's received a PhD from Drake University. Her dissertation focus, which I think we'll touch on today, is about how you transition and your transitioning identity into retirement. Second is Tiffany O'Donnell, CEO of Women Lead Change. Since 2015, she has joined the organization. She's really broadened the scope of the organization, including a brand change, now 5 locations across the Midwest, but really scope in terms of delivering content and thought leadership, not only nationally, but now internationally. And last is Candace Smith, founder of Caregiving, which is an app focused on providing emotional well-being for individuals caring for other adults by providing guidance, curated tools, and care coordination. And Candace has a long history and passion in the world of caregiving, which I know will come out during our conversation. So thank you so much for being a part of our discussion today. And so I'd like to really have you each come and talk a little bit about your organizations and your companies in more detail. But what struck me in our pre-call was how each of you have a personal context to this. I mean, certainly I do, which might come out throughout this conversation. But I think that as we think about this as an employer issue, as a broader issue in workforce, maybe you can share your own personal story. So, Marcia, why don't we start with you, and you can introduce yourself, your company, and your story.
Yeah, Marcia Aldridge, and I'm the Vice President of HR and PMO which we call shared services at IMT. And we're a small property casualty insurance company in West Des Moines. So we serve 6 states surrounding us. And I have been there for about 15 years. So I love the property casualty world, except right now, wherein the storms are a little bit out of control.
Right.
And so my story is twofold. I'm an HR veteran, been in the business almost 30 years. And so caring for the employees over the years, it has changed so much. You're right, Jeff. And thinking about employee engagement, it's not just a one-sided endeavor. We can't just have them engage and produce for us. We really have to care about them as the whole person. And COVID showed us a lot of things. So we knew about the sandwich generation. We knew this was coming, that as our boomers are aging and those of us that are in the workforce were the natural caregivers for our parents. But COVID changed it. It's not just me and my generation. It is many family members caring for other family members. So employee values shifted so much during COVID. And it's time for employers to step forward and really care about that employee. So if we're talking about employee experience and employee engagement, this is a big piece of it. So from a professional standpoint, it's near and dear to my heart because it's another aspect of how I can and help support those employees. But first I have to understand where they're coming from and what their issues are, which is, you talked about this, the holistic employee experience, and that is part of engagement. Me personally, I am a caregiver, a little bit complicated situation because my family is in Oregon and it's not so easy for me to run my parents to the doctor appointments. I do have very supportive siblings and we all, it's sort of like a three-legged stool we each take apart. And sometimes because I am the person who sort of coordinates all of the care, it's a last minute, hey, we need you. So I'm flying out tomorrow to Oregon to take care of another situation that my siblings need my help on. So I'm in it. And I also want to support my employees in it.
Great. Thank you. Tiffany, maybe we'll go to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for bringing us all together, Jeff, because what I see at Women Lead Change, those of you who are familiar with us know we're dedicated to advancing women leaders in their efforts. We want to help women at all levels rise. And what we've seen, we talk a lot about recently, is the childcare challenges that we face. And one of the topics that, to your point, Jeff, we're talking about more, that we need to be talking about more, our in those caregiving roles. And I think what's happened is that there is a bit of a concern about talking about these types of issues when you're at work. It's much easier to talk about needing time away because of a child. It's not always as easy, depending on your employer or your relationship with your employer, to be talking about these types of needs to be away. So I'm particularly grateful that we're putting this conversation out there. Women Lead Change is a data-driven organization, and our numbers tell us that we know that still 61% of the caregivers are women out there. So from a personal standpoint, I can tell you, looks like we're all kind of around the same age in this call. Well, we're so fortunate to have, I'm fortunate to have my parents. I'm really fortunate to have my parents less than a mile away. And I'm even more fortunate to have a sibling who lives within that 1 mile too, because we are on the precipice of all that, of becoming the caregiver, switching that relationship. And I think that's one of the things that I hope we'll talk about too, is the mental health aspect that's so different with this challenge, because caring for parents comes along with a whole set of different challenges than caring for a child. It's very emotional. There's a lot of background noise that comes along with those relationships. There can be anger, frustration. It's a very complicated. It can be a complicated caregiving process, and so add that to the already demands that we know that women face at work. It is particularly challenging. So thank you for bringing us all together, and I really look forward to having a dialogue about not just the issues, but maybe finding some opportunities for our employers to support us as well.
Absolutely. Well, Tiffany, again, thank you and Women Lead Change for partnering with us on this. This is the second time we've had an opportunity to do that, and we appreciate your organization and you're willing to partner on these important topics. So
Thank you.
lastly, Candace, maybe you can tell us a little bit about caregiving and also about your story.
Well, hearing what Marcia and Tiffany already talked about, I was that woman. I was sitting at my desk at work trying to decide, do I go to dad's chemo? Do I prepare for the board meeting that night? Or do I actually pick my kids up on time? And I found that experience to be overwhelming, isolating. We don't talk about it. I sat 2 feet from the HR director. They knew, and yet I felt like the first daughter to ever be caring for a dying parent, which was my story. So I got really angry and I started going down this path of how do we empower caregivers? How do we guide them to resources and support and let them know what options are available to them prior to that moment where they have to make a decision. And that led ultimately to the creation of Caregiving, beginning with a mobile app. Because the majority of caregivers are glued to our devices. We're waiting for that call. We're anticipating you need to fly to Oregon on Thursday because X, Y, and Z. And so that journey has ultimately led us to the employer market, which is a wonderful distribution strategy because employees turn to their employers and ask for help. It may not be, hey, mom is sick, but it could be, I need to take a few days off because I need to care for my mom. And that starts the conversation of caregiving in the workplace.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, maybe we can set this conversation. Tiffany, you suggested data. And Candace, maybe you can give us some data around what this looks like. I talked about 1 in 5 Americans, talked about maybe some gender roles, but maybe give us some context around this about how big is this issue? Where is it moving and the impact to not only individuals, but also to employers?
Well, so I often say that nearly half of all Americans are involved in some form of care for an adult. We're not talking about child caregiving. So whether they are the recipient of that care or they are providing that care. So it is a ubiquitous issue. Sorry, I talk with my hands. I apologize. And so when you look at what caregiving actually does, we know that there is a mental and emotional strain. Nearly half of all informal caregivers have signs of clinical depression. And that is, staggering. In the workforce, the majority of caregivers work almost full time, and they put in another 25 hours informally providing care to a loved one. The statistics are, absenteeism. They have increased absences for impromptu doctor's visits, the presenteeism of spending almost 10 hours trying to search for a single answer on the internet, or on the phone trying to get connected to Medicare or items like that. And then what was my journey was I ultimately left my position. I was an executive director of a nonprofit, and I couldn't decide how to or figure out how to manage this. And so when you look at the statistics of people leaving the workforce to care for a parent, the lost women are 3 times more likely to leave to become a caregiver later in their careers. That is over a $300,000 financial impact to them in lost savings, retirement, and all of that. And it's not an issue that is just for that hourly worker. As you started out, it is the majority of people who are able to leave are managers. And another staggering statistic is supervisors and managers, I think, spend over 12 hours a week accommodating absenteeism and presenteeism and managing work just for caregivers of other adults. And so it's not just that employee, obviously it trickles out to all the supervisors and the whole team.
Great. That's great background. So Marcia, maybe I'll ask you this question. So, as I've had dialogue with other people, sometimes the question comes to me is like, well, hasn't this always been the case? I mean, haven't, our employees been taking care of, in this case, their parents or their children or other things? So what do you think has changed? I mean, I think you started this a little bit in the opening, but what do you think has changed about the conversation now? And why do you think employers in particular should pay more attention to this today than maybe 5 years ago?
I am not sure why it has changed, but maybe it's just the aging demographic of the boomers. So there's such a large group that before that they were caring for us or they were caring for their children. And now this large group has moved forward. And then Gen Xers like myself, who are also a very big portion of the population, it's just time. They're just aging. And the culture has changed. When I was younger, in my younger career, I didn't bring this to the workplace. I had teenagers that were incredibly stressful. EAP was my friend, but my boss didn't know it. I hid that. I checked it at the door, which is what I was told to do. And I suffered in silence. And I was a single mom, so go back to that. But I think many parents that even are married, sometimes that falls on the mom if she's a working, in addition to her family responsibilities. And that wasn't the right case necessarily, because your employees are suffering in silence. And now, as we continue that rhetoric where employees are important to us and we want to care for them, and employee engagement, we want their experience to be good, we have to stand behind that. If I want their experience to be a good one, I have to understand what that experience is. And it's not just my age either. I have some employees that are in their 20s that are caring for their aged parents because they were maybe born later in life. So mom had a child in her 40s or maybe even early 50s. And so their opportunity to caregive in their 20s is there. I have a couple employees that are really struggling with this right now because I'll say developmentally is not the right word, but they're just so young. They should be enjoying their career and just starting out. And they have this huge family burden that they have to care for. And there are no resources. And luckily I can help guide them in the right direction, but I'm super excited for something like Caregiving so that I can have that for my employees and they can do that easily with themselves without having to maybe necessarily share so much with me, which is hard on them as well.
Tiffany, I don't know
Jeff? I do.
Why don't you add on to that? Yeah.
I would. I absolutely love that. Thank you. You know, one of the things in my other life, along with being CEO, I'm also the mayor of Cedar Rapids. And I say that because I am acutely aware of the demographics of our population, which is not unlike the state of Iowa, where we have an amazing older population that is aging very differently today and are clamoring for, you know, things like senior centers and recreation plexes. And we're aging very differently and we're living longer, which is the good news. That also means that those of us who may be pushing 60 are fortunate enough to still have our parents around. So, you know, when I think about, you know, causes to this, you know, to Marcia's point, you know, I think so many of us are living longer and many of us are still in the workplace. I would also say that, you know, the real tragedy of COVID, and it continues, you know, companies are losing those senior people because of this. And we see at WLC, the data shows that the burnout and I think that our last survey with the University of Illinois Chicago said something around, you know, 40+% of the women who took our survey were experiencing mild symptoms of depression. So, you know, when you're I get the opportunity to talk to senior leaders everywhere. And I'll tell you that burnout is real and we lost a lot of them during COVID, and they're still gone because they can. You know, they are in a place in their lives where we can go away. So I just ask for, you know, our employers, we're missing out. You know, we are missing out. And one of the flip side of this is, you know, friends of mine that do continue to work consider work their refuge, which I think is another thing that employers, you know, we should look at. While we used to, you know, be successful at doing 10 things, we are still able to be successful doing one or two very focused things. Work does become a place where we can go, where we're confident. We feel like we know what we're doing, because out there, as you sit on the phone with Medicare and those, oh my gosh, just give me a person to speak to in dealing with, you know, some of these services. It does take a ton of time, but at work, I know what I'm doing. And so we can be very grateful and even more focused if we're honest, and we're allowed to be honest about the responsibilities that we can take on.
No, I think that's true. And I think, you know, both of you sort of touched on this conversation of flexibility. And, you know, I think that's been a hallmark of many employers, you know, certainly coming out of the pandemic, maybe before, but certainly coming out of the pandemic, whether that be hybrid workplaces or how we think about that. Marcia, you mentioned that. Candace, one of the things that has been interesting as we've had these conversations is sometimes we think about, I'm going to call this the burden on employers, right? The idea that somehow, if I have to take care of my parents, that's taking away from what I do. You have an interesting perspective about what employees are learning in that world. And I think it'd be useful to interject that at this point about, folks who are in this environment, what do they bring differently back into the workforce that maybe they didn't bring prior to this experience?
Oh, absolutely. I was going to riff on what Tiffany was saying. A caregiver has tremendous skill sets, conflict resolution, pinching pennies, having difficult conversations, managing multiple priorities. And often we have to make the ROI case for why we should support an employee because, they're costing so much dollars and lost productivity or these things. But in reality, as Tiffany was saying, if we invest with some flexibility, if we give them grace, they are coming back into the office with all of what traditionally are called soft skills, but which are the fundamental skills of leadership back into the office. And it's my hope that we can change the conversation around caregiving for an elder or a child to be less of, it's such a drain and a burden, and more of, wow, this is the type of skills that we need from our employees.
Marcia, my guess is you have a perspective on this too.
I do, and I agree 100%. So when my parents started aging, you can kind of see it coming. But quite honestly, it happened very rapidly. 1 minute it was mom was getting a little slower and not doing so well to falling, and then they were planning. And so many times I had to quickly talk to my boss and say, I've got to go. I have to get in Oregon. Can I work from there? And 3 or 4 years ago, I would never even thought about that. We weren't really set up in the way that we are today. And so I spent the whole month of January and part of February, and I'm heading back now. And I just logged on early at 6. And the gratitude, and I like that word grace, I use it quite a bit, the latitude that I was given to be able to be an adult and figure out my work. Now, I am very privileged. I have a position where I can do some of that. I don't serve a customer. I'm not customer facing. And so I don't have to be bound by certain hours. But my rebound product was tenfold. I mean, I've always given a lot to my employer, but I felt like, wow, this is so great. I'm able to do this, that I never want to leave. I hugged my boss a couple of times, like, thank you. And so I went to him yesterday and I said, hey, gotta, this. And he's like, yeah, got it. Do what you need to do. And, it just makes me feel like I would sing on the rooftops for my employer and my boss. And he's responding in a way that he talks about. So he's living the values that we talk about at IMT. There's one thing that I would caveat that with, and again, I have a very privileged position and schedule. It's not always that easy, and the burden does fall on our managers. And I think we need to help them. We need to help them and educate them and change that paradigm where if you're not here 8 to 5 o'clock, then you're not working, which isn't always the case. But we need to support them and help them make those type of decisions and work what's best for both the employee and the employer. So there's support definitely needed down in the ranks.
Tiffany, I know you have a lot of research in your world about this concept about flexibility and loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think those two things play together in this conversation? I mean, just the sort of personal story that Marcia just told, I think is true in a world where every employer is looking to attract and retain talent, and the cost of turnover continues to be more as people do that. Any thoughts about how the data plays into that?
Yeah. Well, it's all very important. I mean, that flexibility and loyalty, and I think they do go hand in hand. I think a lot of credit goes to Marcia, though, and people like Marcia who are, and their leaders who are willing to have those conversations. I think communication in this environment is extremely important because these are unfortunately temporary. For a lot of us, these are temporary situations. They don't, depending on the family, they go on as short or as long as they do. But I think having a conversation about where you are and having that, what does flexibility look like, and being really intentional about that, that really helps. The other side of that is, again, with caregiving, it's not much different than when our caring for young children. When we're given the opportunity to work in a hybrid environment, women do tend to take that more than our male counterparts do. And, there are consequences to that as well, in terms of visibility and promotion, and making sure that you as an individual are communicating your intentions, that this is the moment in time where you are right now. However, this is where I'd like to be in 5 or 10 years. I think that's important. I think it's really important for our employers to be willing to have those conversations too, so we don't lose the good people.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I'd like to maybe go there for a second. When we were talking in February about emotional health, typically one of the things that's a gap there, which was really interesting in the conversation, is how do we train managers to have these conversations? Managers are not therapists, but how do they end up in this world? Because often they're on the front line. My sense of that, to your point, is not only are managers and supervisors and leaders on the front line of this conversation around caregiving, but they're also in a place to be able to help manage that flexibility. Marcia, I'm curious from your perspective. I mean, in an organization, in a company that's wrestling with this, how do you think about this? I mean, how does that show up in terms of your discussions at the executive level? How does that show up in terms of how you're thinking about preparing leaders going forward?
Yeah, so for us at IMT, we, in the middle of COVID, when it was start, stop, we had discussions like, who are we going to be? Pre-COVID, we were not flexible. We were an insurance company. You came to work, you worked 8 to 4:30, you were at your desk. We didn't have laptops. And just shortly before COVID, we built a new building and had this great technology. And we discussed, hey, we got these laptops. We can move around the building. Isn't that great? We can work from alternate locations, like downstairs. And then COVID hits and we have this great technology, and we send our employees home and they're doing a great job. And it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. And so we start having conversations. We can no longer ignore this. We can't say this isn't possible. We have to change our paradigm. And so we talked about it. We struggled. We arm wrestled. Some were old school, like, nope, this is how it works. You come to work, I can see you. That means I know you're working. If I can see you, that means you're collaborating, you're engaging. I can see it, so it's happening. I was maybe on the other side of it. Like, trust me, I've talked to many employees that are sitting in this building and they are disengaged, they're depressed, they're unhappy, and they have done their best for us. And this was, a year or so ago, and nothing. Show me the data where it shows that we're falling apart or things aren't working. And then we asked the employees, what do you want? What do you need? And they said, we want hybrid. We want to be in the office. We want to be together, but we don't have to do it 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. Let us figure out what's best for our particular situation at this point in time. And so we elected to go hybrid. And so we have some people that are fully remote, and then we have hybrid. And so that flexibility has allowed many of our families to care for the young, the kids that they have, the teenagers that they have. I would have loved that. I just needed to be in my house watching my teenagers to make sure they weren't going to kill each other and do my job at the same time. It wasn't possible. That would have alleviated a lot of stress. And then you have not just aging parents, but so many of our employees are caring for other family members. I have one employee that cares for a mother-in-law and her sister-in-law. And so it's just a variety of ways. And so we struggle with that even today, when many companies are forcing their employees back. And I say force because they're the ones setting the schedule, and the employees I hear kicking and screaming. We have to decide, who are we going to be, and continue to be that, even in the face of other companies doing it differently. What's best for us right now is the hybrid environment. And we have to continue to challenge our paradigms, because what I'm hearing pop up in the articles that I'm reading, well, collaboration suffers and connectedness suffers and relationships suffer. And I keep saying, show me the data. I know you say that, and I know we need connection, and absolutely we got to get creative on how to get it, but it doesn't happen Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, because I will tell you it wasn't happening back then, and it's not going to magically happen just pulling people into the building.
I might just add to that too, Jeff, if I might, that, every industry is different. And I think, Marcia hits the nail on the head. In her situation, that certainly works for them. I've heard from other businesses that really do have difficulty striking that balance because of the work that they do. I can't leave this conversation without putting a call to action out to employers, though, as it relates to reviewing team members who may have chosen hybrid or remote. When I talk about those women, because that's who I study, not getting the promotions because they're less visible, we have to evaluate people differently in their job reviews in this environment and make that fair across the board. We're looking for different things. We are looking at how you collaborate. I'm sure there are ways to show that great people collaborate in a hybrid environment. Take a hard look at how you're evaluating your employees in this new environment. We cannot use the old system to evaluate or promote people either.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to kind of drill back on one of these pieces around managers. So Candace, I think Tiffany said it early on, we might all be about the same age or same stage in life. But yet we have younger people, whether they be millennials, whether they be Gen Zs, who are either in managerial positions, in supervisory positions, or moving into that. How do we have this conversation with the younger and emerging leaders in each of our organizations around this conversation, even though they may not have the personal experience of that by and large, as well as what cues should we train folks to think about in this world?
Well, if I could take a step back,
Yeah.
In Iowa, you're the seventh oldest state. And so when we started talking about caregiving being distributed in Iowa, I was really surprised to learn that the average caregiver here is age 60 caring for an 80-year-old. Nationwide, it's a 46-year-old caring for an aging person. So when you think about caregiving itself here in this state, you have the millennial who is in their first time job really concerned about their mom or their dad who is caring for grandma. And the deterioration of their parents' health, this is not just going to be a 4-year, which is the average caregiver journey. This is a lifelong journey of caregiving. And so that's one thing I wanted to point out. The other thing that I just wanted to make sure, when I'm talking about caregiving, I am not talking about being a home health care aide. I'm not talking about necessarily helping someone get dressed or brush their teeth. Caregiving encompasses anybody who provides physical, financial, emotional, or social support to another adult. So it does require us to think about caregiving quite differently. Your question was, how does the employer, look for signs and start having difficult conversations, because these are all difficult conversations. I don't really have a good answer from the employer side. What we try to do, and what I tried to do, was empower the caregiver, give them the words to go to their supervisor or their HR manager and say, hey, this is what's going on in my home. Just letting caregivers know that they have some protections, that there are rules and regulations, not just for FMLA, but beyond that. And really say, here's how you structure a conversation. Here's how you learn what resources are available to you to empower you to start the conversation, because I think that is really important. I wouldn't want my supervisor going, oh, Candace, are you getting a divorce? Oh, is your mom? But if I were in a position to say, okay, here's what's going on at home, here's how I'm handling it, I don't need accommodation now, but I just wanted to let you know, something like that. I think, as well as educating on the topic, just broadly. As Marcia was saying, people don't plan on being a caregiver. It was the hospice nurse that told me I was a caregiver, and I was offended. I was like, no, I'm a daughter. I'm just doing what my dad needs me to do. We can talk about caregiving as an issue in the workplace, and it's not going to resonate until you get that call. There's a fall, there's a diagnosis, or just the realization that your loved one or the person you care for is needing more support.
Marcia, you mentioned earlier a couple of younger folks in your organization, but if you think people who don't have that experience, How are you thinking about empowering them to have these types of conversations? And I imagine they're much broader conversation than just this particular point, but how are you thinking about, again, those managerial frontline folks having those conversations with your employees to be able to enable the flexibility that you have?
Yeah, and I think Tiffany hits on a really important layer to all of this, right? It's not, we're here talking about caregiving, but mental health, the stress and burden and the issues that employees are facing today, this all goes together. So I might be an employee and I'm having a financial situation or just personal depression. Maybe my career's not going in the right direction, or I'm worried about the environment, the political, whatever it is. The news gives us all kinds of things. I'm facing some really critical things too there, and it has nothing to do with caregiving. And so I think these complex conversations happen for managers more and more, particularly as we make it okay to talk about it, right? Let's go back 20 years. Would you have talked about this in your work environment? You wouldn't, because you would have been, who knows, troublemaker, or you're odd, you're different. We don't talk about that at work. And so we're making it okay. And so I think it's helping our managers be comfortable first and foremost. And like Tiffany said, we've got to break down all these paradigms. The systems have to change. We have to look at people differently, review them differently, evaluate them, check on them. They might be remote or hybrid. It's a great point. How are you doing? I'm not going to just leave you out there and pretend you're happy, but I need to connect and engage. And that's why I think we need to be innovative about the ways that we move forward with how we are looking at evaluating, talking through, and checking these things. I would love to say I have a program in place where I'm going to help my managers. They tend to rebel when I say, hey, there's this training I'd like to give you because it's very important. And so my approach in the next couple of years before I retire is popcorning it, making this available, continuing to talk about it, even being on this panel where I know I have some employees watching, makes it okay to talk through this, just modeling this behavior and having sessions like these available to them so that they can start looking at it with a different perspective. Let's challenge this. Let's look at it differently. Let's really care for our employees like we say we do. And in doing that, we have to listen to them and talk to them and figure out where they are in their lives and where they want to go.
And my sense of that is that, it has really been a change when we, I'll talk about, go back to the pandemic, and we were starting to have this conversation around emotional health when we were asking people, like, how are you? And this wasn't one of those hallway conversations like, oh, how are you? I mean, it was different in that sense. And, that's not something that showed up in my MBA classes, right? They don't teach that in CEO school, but I think we're having these broader conversations about what, this idea about holistic well-being happens in that. Tiffany, maybe coming back to you around this, we touched on this idea of, the impact it has on women leaders, particularly women senior leaders in this. And I think Candace gave us some statistics about what the financial impact is.
Mm-hmm.
As you've seen that, I mean, maybe not just caregiving for an adult, but just generally what the impact is and how employers, again, one of the things you mentioned was this idea about performance reviews and thinking about that differently, but other thoughts that employers can have about how to create this more flexible, inclusive environment to help people manage through many life stages.
I'm so grateful for what Marcia just said, that, she knows she has team members on this call today, modeling the behavior, as you said, Marcia. I mean, I think that's the greatest gift we can give our teams. We can talk a lot about how things should be. When they see you doing what you need to do and the way you're navigating that, I think, we as leaders, when we say, don't send me emails, I want you to be at home at night, be present. Well, don't send emails yourself. We've been saying that for a long time, but this is another example where we can model as leaders, which I think is such a gift. I think it's also, and Caregiving is such a tremendous resource, and I really look forward to learning more about all that it can do. It's a great example, though, of what we as employers can offer now, or are willing to offer now. I mean, we're so open to, we offer, time away for adoption, time away for foster children. We're so much more open to the many ways that people live today. This is just another example. And I just saw in the chat someone wondering, will this be extended, to other to other areas. I think the more that we can find ways to accommodate all the ways that people live, the more we're going to keep the great people. And, ideally when they're on the other side of these, life situations, they'll stay with us. I think that's about it.
So I want to make sure we have enough time at the end here to answer a couple of questions, but before we get there, so I'm going to put on my, business-oriented CFO type of hat and talk a little bit about what's the ROI on this, right? And so it's the soft things I think are important. And you were mentioning, integration into other businesses. Candace, maybe you can give us some sense of, if a business owner, business leader were making the case of the ROI on this, beyond all the great things we've talked about in terms of employee retention and engagement and that, how would you make the case for ROI?
Put me on the spot. The return on investment obviously is keeping people employed. Ultimately, that's the goal, and long-term employed. And being a workplace that ebbs and flows and grows with individuals. So we can, using technology, really quantify, using products like Caregiving, can reduce absenteeism, because we are helping create care circles and other people can participate in taking a loved one or an individual to doctor's appointments. Giving individuals curated guidance. They're spending less hours in Google and more appropriate information, which again, we would like to think that employees are doing this on their off hours, but through our own product, we were seeing that the majority of interaction with our content was happening on Thursdays at lunchtime, as individuals were thinking about seeing a loved one on the weekend. They were trying to get prepared. What do I need to collect? What conversations do I need to have? So again, lunchtime is really meant for people that have a break from work and eat lunch. And so a product like ours, where they can go to a single source of truth and get what they need, allows them to be more present at work. Is that the type of ROI you're looking for? Are you looking like we're going to save X dollars?
Well, no, I think one of the things that I guess you and I have talked about, and maybe I'll just tee it up here, is, as we talked about this idea about, the impact of stress on, caregivers' health. We talked about the impact of those things. And I guess I saw some statistics that said, on average, and again, these are estimates because that, it's like how many hours of this and how much reduction in that. But if you think about the savings in your medical plan, you think about absenteeism. I mean, I've seen statistics of, $1,000 to $4,000 a year in terms of that, in terms of hard cost ROI, maybe hard and soft, right? The lack of using an employee benefit program, the lack of not being at work. But, I think there's some real dollar savings to this.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And if, an individual looks at their benefits package as a whole and they navigate their benefits, helping them to provide care for others, there's even increased savings for both the organization and the individual and their family members. When you help the individual who is providing the care, when you normalize this experience, when you put a community of other caregivers around them so that they know that they have somebody to talk to, that decreases the stress and overwhelm of this experience. And that's really the essence of what we're trying to do, is if you can empower somebody to feel like they have control over what's happening in their life as they care for other adults, they're going to be more present at work. They're going to be more grateful and not take advantage of flexibility. And they're going to turn to colleagues and say, hey, I can't make this shift. Can we swap? That sort of thing. And self-solve, which is a huge benefit for organizations as well. And then, as Marcia said, it's that long-term loyalty, right? That we all want. We want the forever workplace again. And an organization or an employer that shows up when you're at your worst, that's immeasurable. So it's that type of ROI. I think that over the long run, we'll be seeing in future years, though it's very hard to measure in the short term, right?
Yep. So great. So one of the questions that came in on the chat, and Marcia, I'm going to put you a little on the spot, even though this is not your area of expertise. There was a question that came in for small employers under 50 that might not be qualified or have to do FMLA. How do you think about time off for this? How do you think about that flexibility in those workplaces? Do you have any thoughts about that as somebody who spent their career in HR?
Yeah, I do. I actually saw that question. I was thinking through it. It's challenging, right? We're not saying that any of this isn't challenging for the employee and the supervisor. And in the past, what we've done is we've gone to the HR rules. What does the handbook say? The handbook doesn't cover this. Sorry, you can't have time off. If you do, it's unpaid. How about we sit down and talk to the employee and say, okay, here's what's the situation? What can we do? What can we balance? So I have an employee right now that is caring for an uncle and a mother. And sometimes they have to go, they're hourly and they have to go to doctor appointments and different things. That person is the caregiver. And unfortunately, they're young. And so we've sat down and said, okay, what does that look like? I need you to tell me when it is, put it in the calendar, and let's talk about what you can do. Where can we fit in these pockets of work? Now, I don't want you working until 10 o'clock at night because that's extra stress. But let's both come up with a plan and talk through what that does look like. And it's not a perfect answer, but for that particular employee, it does help. And so I think even if you're a small employer, instead of going about it, Tiffany said it perfectly, we have to rethink how we're doing this. Instead of going to the typical HR, here's the process, here's the rule, here's the book. Let's get a little creative and figure out what can we do. And maybe there's a situation you can't really, if you're going to be gone for 4 weeks at a time, that's not a situation that we can really help. But maybe there's 2 hours in pockets here and there that we could do. And then there was one more thing I want to pop in there as Tiffany was talking about the ROI. So some of this, so many things in HR. I wasn't hired for my math skills, right? So the ROI is a lot of anecdotal, but you see it in the end product. And I think in situations like this, where we have maybe the tool of Caregiving or the conversations, that employee and the employer, the supervisor can be very clear about that up front. And so we've created a plan and a structure for that time versus, I'm not going to say anything, I'm a little ambiguous, I'm going to secretly go over here and Google this for a couple hours because there's a rabbit hole, and the care that mom needs right now, I can't wait until tomorrow's lunch. And so if we openly communicate about this, then the return on that investment right there is immediate, because the employee is specifically talking about it, opening that conversation, and we know where it's going to come together versus this big ambiguous hole that we don't really know what's happening.
Well, I want to be cognizant of our time, and I want to end on two things. There was a question really about the future of Caregiving. So Candace, I want to give you an opportunity to say, where is the Caregiving app? The specific question was, how might it be distributed in the employee benefit space? And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then we'll end with Tiffany giving us an update on Women Lead Change.
Absolutely. So earlier this month, we relaunched the app with a new user experience. And feature sets that include care coordination and guidance and support and care circle management. So that is available through the end of June in the App Store for free. So if anybody is interested in getting a sense of what the app can do or needs it for themselves, we'll supply a link to that in our event follow-up. Moving forward, thanks to you, Jeff, Delta Dental of Iowa will be distributing Caregiving through its employee benefit channel. And we're still working out the details on how that will be done. But as the product director of Caregiving, we can ensure that if there is a group, if there is an individual that is going through a caregiving event or wants to offer this to their employees, to their stakeholders, that's our mission, and we will make that happen. We're here to normalize this experience, and we're here to put the resources that supervisors and employers and individuals need in their hands at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we'll figure it out. But if you are working with Delta Dental, your account manager will have more information, or you can always email me. I like to talk about Caregiving and helping communities and employers.
And one of the specific questions is whether it'll be embedded or whether it be standalone. My sense of that is it'll probably be both. We're still working through the pilot, but if somebody who isn't a customer, well, you should be, but if you're not, you can come in and get that, but we'll certainly be offering it to our customers on the dental, vision, and legal side. So thank you. Tiffany, thank you so much for partnering with us on this in terms of you bringing this to light. Again, I think we are in the early innings of this conversation. While it's happened for a while, I don't think it has maybe the resonance that maybe we've talked about mental and emotional health over the last few years. But talk a little bit about anything new at Womenly Change and how people on this call can tap into your resources.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Well, our website, wlcglobal.org, has all things WLC, but for purposes of this group, we also have leaned into the need to be flexible. And so we do so much more virtually, including a program that kicks off the month of March. It's 3 days in May and March, an entirely virtual series called Advocates and Allies. And this is featuring 3 thought leaders on various topics around workplace culture. So for example, if you may have seen him, he's always a fan favorite. We've had him in Des Moines, I think in maybe Cedar Rapids as well, Dr. Steve Robbins. He's going to be doing, he's a diversity expert. Experiential intelligence is the next topic we'll be talking about. This is harnessing the power of experience. It's the XQ that we talk about. And women sometimes always say, oh, I can't do that job because I haven't done X, Y, and Z before. Well, actually, what is your experiential intelligence? And so Soren Kaplan has a book on that all attendees will get as well for being a part of that. And then the third day in May is Rising Together, How We Can Bridge Divides and Create a More Inclusive Workplace. And this is, again, a repeat WLC speaker, Sally Helgeson. So this is a virtual series, again, allows for flexibility. You receive the books in this, and it kicks off May 11th. So that's the purpose of this call. We also have workshops as well as major conferences coming up in the fall. So just check out the website.
Great. Well, I want to thank all 3 of you. I think this has been a good conversation. I think that, we probably could have spent another hour kind of going another layer deep and another layer deep in this. But I do think that for the folks that were on our webinar today, they got to join a little bit in our conversation about how employers and employees are dealing with this really important and I think emerging issue. So appreciate all of your time. Marcia's got to jump on another panel. She's a well sought out speaker, so we appreciate that. Candace, thanks for your time and your work with Caregiving, and Tiffany, as always, thank you for your partnership. So we'll give you a couple minutes back to maybe grab a quick water or hit the restroom before you hit another call or another meeting. But thank you so much for joining us with the Green Room. We know you have lots of places to get inspired and get information. We appreciate you spending your hour with us. So have a fantastic day.